Matt Burris, very excited to have you today. I could give this whole backstory. I could share how we met, but I think actually for everybody listening, they probably have already heard about you, and they probably heard about you quite recently. They've probably seen your viral, very viral LinkedIn posts. They've probably read a lot of your papers and white papers that you've put out, really all within the last, year or two? Is that right?
Yeah, about 14 months, I want to say.
14 months. So for anyone who's not familiar with Matt and his work and who he is, this man is, I would say, the most active and vibrant and to be respected voice in the startup studio community right now. He has a ton of viral posts on LinkedIn. And I'm really curious, 14 months ago, who was Matt Burris? How did you go from no one knows about this man to now the number one voice in the space that people are really listening to, are really paying attention to? All your posts are really hitting strides. What happened, my friend?
Well, before I answer that, first, thank you, Jake. You've been in this space and very active in this space a lot longer than I've been active in this space. Studios better than probably most people out there, including myself in many ways. So, if I can create content that, plans really, really well for you and helps, shape the topic, that's fantastic. And I actually have to credit Al Parcellin at Enhanced Ventures for this one. So I was going through the GSSN bootcamp on studios. My first exposure to studios was back in 2011. But going through that program, Al Pear pointed out, LinkedIn is a really, really valuable way to connect with investors, entrepreneurs, and everybody you're going to want to work with as a studio. And I was like, all right, I've been on LinkedIn a while. I don't do a lot. So started by commenting, saw nothing. So I wrote up 5 posts, dropped them, Monday through Friday. And I think I had 50 to 100,000 views at the end of that week.
Wow, okay. 1 week.
In 1 week. The LinkedIn algorithm has changed since then. Yeah, I could not repeat that again today, but that hooked me. And then a month in, I dropped 1 post on a Monday, had 50 inbound connection requests, half of which were investing professionals. So partners at venture funds, family offices, private equity funds, and wealth managers. Okay, I can't get that kind of value going to a conference. This is amazing. I have to keep doing this. And all that was before I went viral the first time in December of 22. And that post was kind of extreme, almost 1.5 million views, I want to say, on that post. So that created a lot of discussion around the space. And the results, people, if you're not posting content on LinkedIn, I cannot understate or how valuable it is. I mean, it takes a lot of work. As anyone who creates a lot of content will tell you, I've used AI a handful of times. It really can't write anything in this space. It doesn't have the context.
Yep.
It can help you edit. It can help you write some hooks, but that's about it. Everything else is me.
So where would you say you were on the scale of when you were getting started writing on LinkedIn? Mm-hmm. How much did you know about startup studios then compared to how much you know about startup studios now?
So I'd been involved at that point in, I want to say, 3 different efforts to launch a studio. I was more of the team members involved in those shows. So had some context. I'd just gone through that GSSN boot camp. So I've been studying the space actively for probably a little bit more than a year, looking at doing my own studio. So I had a lot of that context. And of course, going through the GSSN program, talking to a lot of partners, talking to a lot of studios, had some context. As I started posting, I had so many studios start reaching out to me for conversations. They were interested in, some of the insights I was sharing. They wanted to, share what they were working on, how they were approaching it a little differently. And I think at this point, I'm up to probably between 300 and 400 conversations with the studios all over the world. It's incredible. I think one of the biggest takeaways is the breadth of how the studio models actually applied in the real world. Most people, 99% of the time, see startup studio, venture builder, like, okay, you're targeting building a unicorn startup, right? You're going to go raise venture money. You're going to go build this giant company. That's the goal of the studio. And what I've seen is that that's just one of many, and it can go as far as just building small businesses, and that can still generate equivalent or better than top tier venture returns, which is really interesting from a model perspective. The studio is about building businesses, pull the right resources around to build a specific kind of business, and the model can work. You have to change a lot of your operations around it to make it fit in what you're doing, so you still generate the right returns you need.
Yep.
But it's very, very flexible, which opens up a big can of worms from the investment side too.
Something I've been curious about, and before we get into the meat of this episode, just like evaluating a studio, I got to ask, there's always been a challenge for people in the studio space, whether they are themselves launching a studio or like I remember our early days with GSSN when we were like trying to bring everyone together. The challenge is about finding all the people in the world that are intrigued by studios and interested in it. Like just getting the attention on LinkedIn or any other platform has always been really challenging. Like first, the biggest challenge was let's start by finding all the studios in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, and we did that in, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, more than that, 7 years ago. And then the question was, well, now how do we get all the people like the investors and the private equity folks, the VCs, the entrepreneurs who now know what studios are, but like have a chance at investing in a studio? How do we get their attention? And it seems like you've done that. You're the first person to actually get like outside of the silos, the echo chambers of the studio community with your posts. What would you credit that to?
I think it was a couple things. Like you don't go viral instantly. Like at least I didn't. I was writing from every day from August to the middle of December, roughly. Every post was about either startup studios or a couple in there about startups and, startup processes like lean startup and that kind of stuff. But very focused. That let me build a little bit of an audience up. Very, very active in engaging with anybody that posted and people outside of, the community. That really helped build up that interaction, which is key to going viral. And I think it was just a little bit of timing. And actually, what went viral was some of the numbers that GSSN came up with in their second white paper. Those numbers had been out for years. They were not new. It's just that it was the first time a lot of people saw them. And the numbers are so striking, they're polarizing, right? You see 53% return. You go, okay, either this is like the best thing ever, or it's a scam. Like, what is going on? Like, how is this even feasible? Okay, great. Getting attention is step one, right? Now let's explore how the model actually is able to deliver those kind of returns. And, just like anything in venture, there's a distribution. If 53% is the average, and that's a small sample size, there's several that perform well beyond it and a lot that perform below that.
Yeah. So I'm sure you get asked all the time, Matt, is this a scam? This looks like a scam, smells like a scam. It's probably a scam.
Well,
So how do you react to that?
It can be. How about that? I think this is one of the big challenges in the studio space today. The model is so attractive. The numbers are so good. People will use the name to get access. And I've come across a number of studios that do push those boundaries a lot. And they do it in a few different ways. If you look at the definition of a studio, and there's no formal definition today, but the one that most folks in the space end up using is, the studio is going to play a founder role. They're going to make a capital investment. They're going to actively support for generally a lot longer than 3 months. It's often 12, even 18 months or more. That's not an accelerator, right? That's not an investor. It has elements of them. And it's also, while they are bringing a team, they are doing work and building part of the startup and part of the product, they're not necessarily doing that for sweat equity. Sometimes, yes, but it starts blurring the line of, I think, a critical element in a studio, which is being the founder, right? Playing that founder role. And, often you see groups show up that don't play that role, don't provide the capital investment, but still want to take a full founder share. And that gets really problematic. Yeah. You know, if say you and I want to partner in starting a company, you know what, I'm going to be your co-founder. I want 50%. I'm not making any investment. I'm just going to work for it. And I'm only going to stick around like 3 months. Like anybody in the startup world knows that that deal makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. We call them vulture studios versus venture studios.
Yes.
At that point.
Happens in venture capital. It happens in the venture studio space as well.
Yep.
You know, it's going to happen everywhere where there's a lot of money involved and the economics are great. So when I talk to anyone from investors to entrepreneurs looking to partner with studios, my advice is judge them harshly.
Yeah. So that's a good segue then into like the big question. And I want to start with it high level and then chisel down into the three or the main stakeholders, whether you think there's more than three. How do you evaluate a studio? So like at the highest level, if whether you're an investor, you're an entrepreneur, you're a VC, you're a new studio, how do you evaluate one? But then let's dig into each. Like what should you be looking at if you're thinking about becoming an LP, or if you're thinking about becoming an EIR, or if you're thinking about launching your own?
Sure. You know, there's a lot of ways to start answering that question. When I look at the design of a studio, and this is one of the ways to evaluate it, every studio has 4 customers. They've got the investors in the studio itself, so the economics have to work for the investors. They've got the staff and the general partners, whoever's running the studio is involved. They've got they need a salary. They want to participate in what they're creating. It has to work for them. You've got the entrepreneurs that you're going to partner with to build these startups, and that deal has to work for them. And then you've got follow-on capital. And I very specifically use the term follow-on capital because this does not necessarily mean venture capital. Okay. But you have to make this work for everybody. Very few businesses have 4 customers, all who have to say yes. A studio does. It doesn't necessarily create any specific constraints until you start actually designing the studio itself. So, you know, if your plan is to spin out companies to go raise a Series A, okay, you started defining some of this. You now know that your companies need to perform at the Series A level when they spin out. So did you provide enough support? You know, finances, the team, are you supporting them long enough to build something that has the right traction that Series A investors could get behind it? Does the cap table look right for those investors? Those 2 areas are the single biggest areas where I see studios make fundamental mistakes. The cap table is too messed up for those investors to say yes. There was not enough progress made. And now the portfolio company has to move down market. It's effectively a down round, which means the cap table has to get readjusted for them, for, say a seed investor to say yes. And now the investors in the studio are like, okay, this is not good. Like, you've just butchered our potential returns because you're going to have to potentially make this deal with every company that you're building. So getting the design right early is very, very valuable. Trying to fix some of these issues later on is often destructive to a studio.
Yeah, super costly as well.
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with then the perspective of thinking about launching a new studio.
So if you're going to go,
where do you start?
Yeah,
and what are your big considerations?
Well, let's start with why. What is your purpose behind launching a studio? Just like a venture fund, this is a long-term endeavor, right?
Yeah.
A venture fund life might be 10 years, but the way those things play out is you got to raise fund number 2 and then number 3 before you've shut down fund number 1. The studio often operates kind of the same way. So this is not a 10-year commitment. This is like, think 20, think 30-year commitment. If this is not something that you love doing, don't do it. So let's start with the basics there. Beyond that, it's, what is your thesis? What kind of companies do you want to make? What's the impact that you want to have?
Yeah.
Where are you going to do this?
Can you give an example of a really damn good thesis that you've seen here and then a not so great one? Because I think people may not really know what it means when someone's like, what is your startup studio thesis? They may not actually know what that means, because that's different from like, what's your value prop, or like, what's your niche in your industry? Like, what is your thesis?
Let me use a couple of examples. I'll use, I don't know their specific thesis, but it's a studio that a lot of people might be aware of. Flagship Pioneering. They are building biotech startups from the ground up. They will envision what needs to happen in the biotech space and figure out how to go build it. They'll partner with universities sometimes to do it, license IP, also from large companies in the space. That's really specific. You know what kind of companies they're building. They're not really building software companies in that space. It's biotech. Okay, what the thesis, the more focused your thesis, the more condensed the thesis, the easier it is for investors to self-select, are they in or are they out? Which is oddly a very, very valuable thing to do because, just like startups trying to raise venture money, investors in studios and venture funds don't like to say no because they might be back later. So the easier it is for investors to say, you're not in my thesis, right? You're not in an area that I invest because of your thesis, saves you a lot of time.
Sure.
It also helps identify a little bit of how you're going to be designing your studio in the first place, right?
Yep.
Now, a broader thesis can be very problematic. Hey, we're going to go build B2B SaaS startups all over the world. How do you even organize that?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have investor relationships all over the world? Do you know the conditions all over the world to judge if the company you're going to build makes sense? Like, who's going to acquire it? What are the valuation standards in that region? There's just too much to know to really pull together into a studio to make that work.
Yeah.
So the tighter you get, the easier it is to start.
If you could back 3 studios right now, you don't have to name who they are unless you want to or can. Can you share why those 3 studios you would back today?
So, I'm not going to name them because let's not throw out some endorsements yet.
Sure.
Also, I haven't done the full due diligence behind them. So based on what I know, there is in the EU, a studio in the health space that has been doing a fantastic job. They built well over 100 companies. Their performance is great. They've built a really, really strong network for pulling in IP and tapping angel investors to get things off the ground. Very, very interesting, right?
What about the EU? So the things gut, what you brought up from your gut was like, first thing, they're in the EU. So you mentioned their geography.
Mm-hmm.
Then you mentioned their industry, healthcare. And then you mentioned their track record
Yeah.
as a studio. What is it about geography, industry, and track record that make that your first 3 pieces of criteria for evaluating a studio?
Well, geography from an investment standpoint, like, can I make the investment in that geography? I named them first mainly because recency bias. I've talked to them recently, so I know a lot more about them.
Sure.
But the EU, like the 2 hot areas for studios, EU and the US, they're about equal, about a third of all studios are in each one of those regions. The EU actually, I think, performs really, really well for studios. VCs are more open to them. Culturally, it just fits better. And in the space that they're in, medical, the studio model makes a ton of sense. Generally, these companies take a lot more resources to build, grow, and scale. And having a lot of the foundational resources in place to build them just makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And of course, the fact that they've built 100 companies and so far their returns are looking pretty good, that helps, right? But that's also an established studio. Now let's pivot and let's look at an emerging studio, one that I know is actively raising right now. Like, okay, the founders behind the studio have built and scaled and sold a company. All right. So they've demonstrated they can do that. Some of the investors that they've brought in are corporates and experts in this industry space where they are focusing. They've built an amazing network behind them all across that industry, helping at all levels. Like, that's a really compelling opportunity that they're starting to pull together. And one thing I always like in the studio space is those early investments, often, not always, but they can be effectively permanent return vehicles. If a studio is raising as a holding company or specifically offers something that's generally referred to as a GP stake, that investment doesn't necessarily exit, right? You just hold it. So as long as the studio is operating, they're going to go probably raise, if they move into the dual entity model, another fund. Well, you didn't have to put money into that fund, but you're going to benefit from generally the common stock ownership that the studio takes. Yeah. And when those companies generate return, you continue to participate as long as the studio's around. That's really interesting. So when those opportunities show up, you've got the right founding team together. They're really, thinking about building the right network, the right capability behind them. It gets very interesting.
Over the last, let's say, like 3 to 6 months, as you see all the new faces that are popping up in the space, and a lot of people are really excited about it, what category of people are seeming to be popping up the most and are now the most populous, whether it's like potential investors, potential entrepreneurs in the space, or potential new studio GPs?
Well, there's a lot of people that are attracted to the studio model to start one. The returns are absolutely there. The challenge often is that, people like the idea of building. The economics, great. And they think it might be easier.
What do you say to that? Well, you laugh. You start by laughing.
I laugh because anyone who's gone and tried to build a studio knows how difficult this is.
Yeah.
I've done a hardware startup. I'm working on a software startup in one of our portfolio companies. A studio is effectively a software startup times a venture fund level of difficulty. It's crazy difficult. Putting all the pieces in place to operate a studio, to execute everything you have to do effectively, all the playbooks, all this, it's building a startup while building a startup while building a fund. It's not easy, but literally earlier this week, I had a call with somebody who's like, no, studio model sounds very simple. Like, okay. On the surface, it does. Like, conceptually, it sounds great. Hey, it's an organization. We've got a team here. We've got a process. We've got some playbooks, and we're just going to build company after company after company. Sure. Now organize that. It's the legal structure behind it. It's how all the teams interact. It's how the deal flow is going to work. Are you lining up future investors, and how are you finding your founders? All the little fiddly bits come together and make this just an incredibly challenging endeavor to pull off well.
Yeah. One of my favorite analogies that I kind of came across, and it was years ago, well before COVID, was you're really good at baking pies. Which means you're really good at selling. You sold a company. You sold a successful company. So you're great at baking pies. And now you want to open a pie shop, and you think it's going to be the same. Meaning now you want to open a studio and launch lots of startups. Running a pie shop is very different from baking a great pie. When you bake a great pie, you don't have to worry about real estate. You don't have to worry about insurance. You don't have to worry about utility bills. You don't have to worry about hiring staff and cleanup and all those things. You don't have to worry about a person from the health inspector's office coming in to check it out. So it's and you're not even baking pies anymore the same way you were. You're baking a system to bake pies. And I think a lot of exited founders, people have sold companies for hundreds of millions of dollars. These are by no stretch of the imagination not successful entrepreneurs. They're incredibly successful. They are thinking well, I could do that, so I could do this. But it's then they go and do it, and they realize it's not at all the same thing. And then they're like, oh shit, this was... different than I expected. What do you say to that?
That is par for the course. One of the studios I talked to a year ago, they built multiple companies, right? They're going after their first actual external fundraise. They're gearing up for it. And to put everything in place so that they could go do that. So all their operations are tied up. We've got the playbooks ready. The legal structure is now the right way to go raise all these little pieces. While, of course, they were still building companies. It took a year to put in place.
Which is actually not very long in the grand scheme of this.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's just the details get you.
Yeah.
And when you look at some of the places that people come from to go do a studio, you mentioned, the serial founder. Okay, they built a pie. They built one. Okay, cool. Well, what about folks that just worked on helping make a pie?
Yeah.
Okay, they don't have the full founder experience. They've got a lot of exposure to a lot of places, but do they have all the right skill sets? And when I look at a studio, every studio wears 3 hats, and they got to execute all of them really, really well. They've got to be an entrepreneur. So they've got to find those opportunities or the people that they're going to partner with. They got to see that vision, help navigate all those ups and downs along the way. But they've also got to be the investor and judge the entrepreneur hat and everybody that's working in that and the opportunities they're coming up with harshly, right? They have a fiduciary duty to their investors to treat their money well.
Yep.
Okay, so that's a very, very different skill set generally. And then on top of that, you have the operations skill set. The studio looks a lot like a consulting firm or a design agency. You've got a lot of teams working on different projects in different areas. It all has to come together.
Yep.
Most people don't have all these skill sets.
Yep.
Does the team have all the skill sets that are going to go do the studio? If the founding team doesn't, their early hires better bring it in, or there's some very big problems waiting.
Yep. Well, let's shift gears slightly as we're moving through this, the time we've got today. Let's talk about the design of a studio. Mm-hmm. Let's start by just rattling off the laundry list of the constraints that you look at first. And then let's start to dig into the ones that we think are most relevant to really shed some light on today.
Sure. So generally, I always start with, what's your thesis? What ecosystem are you going to operate in? Because that starts to shape a lot. Who's on your team? What's the background? What skill set do they have? Again, it's some foundational capabilities we have to work with. Then what's the founder role that you're going to play as a studio? You can play many. But generally, I think of these as you can be the founder. You're going to find the idea and you're going to validate it. And then you're going to bring in either a founder or CEO, depending on how long you've built this company out, how mature it's gotten. You can be the co-founder studio. So you and I might partner at or around the idea stage, and we're going to validate and go build this company together. You can be the late co-founder, where you're coming in after a startup has already been legally formed. They've got some validation, maybe some product market fit at some level. They might have a product. They might even have revenue, but you're joining as a co-founder. You're generally bringing a very, very valuable skill set, because otherwise, why are you joining as a co-founder, to that startup to make them successful? You're going to go build together. The other form is kind of unique to studios. It's the refounder model. This is where you're licensing IP or acquiring a small company to use as a foundation to build something new on. I've seen all of these models. All of them can work, but they run a little bit differently. And each one of them, like the operations of each one of those founder roles, does bring some nuance that is really critical to the design at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got the customers that you're going to serve and that you're planning to work with. That starts creating some more design constraints. And then you get to the meat of like how you're really planning to run this thing. And this is stuff like, how many companies do you want to create every year? Right? Okay, so that's picking that number is going to start defining how many people you're going to have. Are those people in the studio, or are they going to be hired by the companies you're creating? How much are you going to invest in each one? Okay, now you're starting to figure out what your fund size has to be, how much capital you have to have on hand, and how long you're really going to be able to provide support to each of the companies you create. And all of these things start interacting. And these are just the high level decisions, right? Let's not even get into the nitty gritty details that really make a big difference.
Yeah. What do you think is the number one reason studios fail in the last 2 years?
So number one is probably they couldn't even raise money. Once they raise money, then I would say it's probably more along the lines of their execution. They were not pursuing opportunities that were really aligned with what they had in mind for an end goal. And so the companies that they created just couldn't raise funding. There was no traction in the market, and then they just kind of shut down.
Yeah, they fizzled out a little.
Okay. Now, there's another failure, which is also interesting to point out because it's not uncommon. I guess it's relatively uncommon, but it happens enough that it's a thing. And that is a studio fails because they were so successful. One of their first couple of portfolio companies became a unicorn and sucked the entire studio into it.
Kind of one of those like champagne problems to have.
Oh yeah. Like, if you're going to fail, building a unicorn is a great way to go, And there was actually a studio in Atlanta that happened to. Greenlight, a local unicorn company, came out of that studio, and it sucked the whole studio into Greenlight.
If you could study 3 studios from history, only 3, to base your new studio design or new thinking off of, which 3 would you pick and why?
Well, I would probably start with Idea Lab.
Okay, classic.
Classic, right? Started in 96. They've built over 150 companies, I believe. They've got a track record. They've got a lot of experience. I think just from the volume of information that they have and exposure, there's a lot of lessons to learn there. The next one I would pick is going to vary based on where am I focusing as a studio, right? If I'm doing biotech, I'm going to go Flagship Pioneering or anything that's more deep tech related, right? If, even hardware, I'd probably go to somebody like Flagship because they're dealing with super difficult problems. They have to have a very big staff and support system to build these companies. Yeah. I want to understand what that is like, how that impacts the rest of my operations. Beyond that, I would probably go for some studio that's I'm going to learn the most operationally from, relevant to what I'm trying to build. So that might be somebody like Atomic. That could be a Redesign Health, again, if I'm still in the health space. But I want to understand how they leverage network, how they hire, how they run this thing at a really high level and get access that almost nobody else can get. I want to see this thing working. Yeah. Yeah. Lots of lessons to pull from. And of course, across all of them, what's the relationship with investors? Not just investors in the studio. Follow-on investors are probably the most critical element. You have to lay the right groundwork so that the portfolio companies you create can get funded. Yeah. And that's a lot of work. It's a huge piece of running a venture fund. It's a huge piece of running a studio too.
Who do you think's done a really good job at fostering a great relationship with the whole world of venture and all the VCs out there so that they don't run into as many issues with raising follow-on capital?
I think one of the interesting ones to look at is not a high volume studio, but Sutter Hill. They are a venture fund. They're an evergreen venture fund. So they're unusual to begin with, but they also run a studio model. And one of the companies they built was Snowflake. They've built
biggest tech IPO of all time.
Exactly. Right. And it's interesting because I was hearing a podcast about a year ago, and a very, very well-known, recognizable VC, unfortunately I don't remember his name right now, was commenting that he had looked at investing in Snowflake. He had passed because of the studio model. And he was like, I don't want to make a mistake like that again. So one of the things I definitely encourage a lot of studios to do is, a lot of VCs are going to pass. They don't like the studio model today. They need the exposure to what comes out of a studio so that in hindsight, later on, they'll start changing their mind because they see the quality of what gets built and the result, and they missed out on a good deal that they could have gotten in on.
I'll share a story that this brings up. I remember it was COVID. I remember I was at a coffee shop with a mask on in the prep for this event, but we hosted an event years ago, and it was basically a webinar / roundtable between T.A. McCann at PSL and two of the partners at a VC fund that they work very closely with, Costa Noah Ventures. And the question was about what kind of relationship do you two have with each other and why? And basically, to sum it all up, it was we have a very close friendship-like relationship where us as the VCs are looking at 500 deals a week. And we have an amazing ability to say, here's what's not being built in this space right now that should be built in this space right now. But we haven't seen the right founders or the right execution of that yet. But we can say this should be built because we just looked at the entire space for like a month and we saw every deal. And then they call up their friends at Pioneer Square Labs and say, build it like this. But we want first look at it as the VCs. And PSL is psyched because they're like, well, great. It's going to be much easier to recruit an entrepreneur because it's like we have verbal or whatever type of commitment to get an entrepreneur or to get the first round in. So they feel like, okay, if I build it like this, I'll have a way easier time raising money. They have someone to call right away. And it's like that type of symbiotic relationship, I think, is brilliant. And the purpose of this call was encourage those types of, you don't need anything formal. You don't even need to sign a document. It just means like have a recurring monthly call with each other or grab a beer or go for a hike every now and then and just talk about what you're each seeing, because putting those two minds together is brilliant in this regard.
Oh, for sure. And, talking to a lot of studios, in fact, I don't think there's a single studio that I've talked to that would not welcome any venture fund coming in and looking at any one of their portfolio companies, all of them. They want more venture funds. They want better relationships with those funds. And to your point, when a venture fund like sees that there's a really big opportunity to go after, they're a venture fund. They're an investor. They need something to invest in. And a studio's job is to create something that is investable, create a successful business. There's a great opportunity for a lot more collaboration in this industry along those lines.
There's a lot of debate, obviously, about studios, which I think is great. Like there should be. And a large reason why the gallery exists is to create a home for that debate. We welcome it. But I think, and I have my opinions and perspective on this. I'm really curious yours. Why do so many VCs despise the studio model? Like they don't even dislike it or reject it. They despise it, which is a very strong word. Why do you think that is?
So if it's at the despise level, I think it's something along the lines of there's a little bit of jealousy there. Right? A studio, if a company comes out of a studio and shows up at, say, the seed level investor, that investor, they're generally for that whole seed round, and most venture funds don't take the whole seed round, they're going to share it. So that whole seed round is probably around 20% is what they're looking for as a stake. But that individual venture fund's probably going to get 8, 10, somewhere in there. Okay. The studio showed up with like between 30 and 50 sometimes. And they're sitting here like, how? You're getting 3-5 times my ownership? Like, this is not fair. So that's part of it. The other part is it does trip a common red flag that every venture fund in the world looks for. And that is ownership percentages. The founders and staff of a startup have to have enough of a stake that they're going to carry on and build this thing for the next several years. And when a studio shows up and takes a huge piece, VCs get concerned. Completely understandable. Like, makes a ton of sense. When you drill down, it's really interesting though. The red flag that gets triggered is, hey, there's not enough basically employee and staff and founder ownership. Okay. But what if you look at the individual level? Like the startup might have 5, co-founders. The individual stake of each one of those founders is pretty low now. And when you look at this in the context of a studio, and the studio replaces the need for at least one founder, and they optimize the dilution that company is going to take over the next several rounds, the founder that partners with the studio might have much more ownership in the company that they're a founder in than the other portfolio companies in this venture fund. So, yeah, you got to look at the individual level. And, I released a model back in July of this year showing kind of like somewhat of a normal case in the studio world, but it also looks extreme. Studios taking half, right? It's literally co-founding day one. And then it creates an options pool, dilutes both the studio and the one founder they're partnering with. Critical thing here is studio plays the role of a founder. And so if there's two co-founders the studio's working with, they don't take 50%, they drop it down. It needs to be relatively on par. If it goes too far outside of that, then you start to break the model. But even when you're talking about taking that large a stake, and then you make a preferred investment as the studio to take more equity, you're diluting both your common ownership and the founder's ownership and the options pool. Hey, guess what? That founder can still own, I think the number was 20% more equity in their own company as a relative basis, not absolute ownership. Then if they went through the traditional approach of, hey, I'm going to get some angel money, I'm going to get a pre-seed, I went through an accelerator, and I land at the seed stage, and seed stage for outside investment on both fronts, they have less ownership. And it was stunning how big the difference was, but only do you see this, one, if you look at the details, individual ownership levels, but also you see how the dilution actually plays out over time in a startup.
I think there's been a lot of up and down over the last couple of years from the LPs in the space. There was a list that was published a few years back of like, here are all the LPs that have backed notable startup studios. And there's some wonderful names in there. I mean, massive funds, massive private equity groups, corporations, like huge individuals like Bezos Expeditions and whomever else. But no, lately we've heard chatter of a few funds that are popping up to be the first and sole LP in only investing in startup studios. But it seems like it's kind of been up and down. They're here for a bit and then they go quiet, or they're like, there's a big announcement that doesn't really happen much. Obviously, there's the reality of like, well, we're having a harder time actually raising the money than we thought, so we have to slow it down. Or the market crashes and now we can't do what we wanted to do. So, but what do you think? Like, give us your sort of, to the extent you're able to, like your unfiltered perspective of what's going on the LP side of things when it comes to backing the next vintage of startup studios and or their portfolio companies.
Well, when you look at those big names, they're not backing studios. They're backing individuals that they know and trust. And so just like if you're going to go to a venture fund for the first time, you can't go to the big institutional investors. They're going to say, no, you're not raising enough money. You don't have a track record. They're going to be polite, but they're really saying no.
They're laughing you out of the room.
Yes. You should not have shown up yet. You're not big enough to ride this ride, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you look at, let's completely reverse it. How do most studios get their first fund? And the answer is their personal network. So my rule of thumb for anybody looking to do a studio and wanting to raise money to start is if you can't send an email and raise half of your fund in a week, don't do it.
Yeah. And I think that's $3 to $5 million.
Minimum. For some, this is 10 million, to start. For some, it's a lot more. But if you can't just tap your network, raise your hand and say, hey, I'm going to go do this. Who's in? And they say, you know what? I want to see your materials, but put me down. Like soft or hard commit. Like I'm interested for this amount. If you can't get enough soft circled that way, at least 50%, you got problems.
Yeah. And I think for folks listening, if your gut is like, well, that's crazy. Like, why would I ever be in that position? What it really is about, in my opinion, is if you can't do that for yourself, what makes a founder think you can do it for them? And that's what they're signing up for when they join your studio. Is that's it. If you can't raise $5 million in 2 to 3 weeks, how are you going to do that for numerous companies at a time when they're all relying on you to help them do that?
Yeah, that, and what kind of support are you really providing? It's so when I go back to the 4 customers, one of the danger areas is you can easily craft a deal that entrepreneurs will say yes to, that investors like, but it doesn't work for follow-on capital. Like, the ecosystem will reject it. You have to know everything, and make sure you design this thing for the whole ecosystem. This is not just, hey, founders are in. Well, that's one small piece.
Yeah.
And it's too easy to make that mistake.
Totally. Well, we have a few minutes left. Let's do sort of a rapid fire round.
Sure.
Short answers here. What are the top books, resources, podcasts, whatever it is that you think folks that are interested in the space should start with consuming?
So go look for all the white papers in the space. The Vault Fund publishes a ton of absolutely top tier, fantastic resources. They're probably the number one thing I refer people to, right? Because the other resources, white papers that are out there are, they tend to be a little bit more higher level, which is great to understand the space. But if you want details, the folks that have been investing in studios since 2015 are where you go.
Yep. Got it. What do you think the space looks like for the investors in the world in 3 years?
It should be back up on the upswing, but now that means is the opportunity to actually invest. Like, historically, every time you've got economy like we have today, this is when all the startup investments pop, right? The investments made now. I think you're going to see the same thing in the studio space. They've got a little bit longer to build, which is great, and they can accelerate everything they build, which helps them hit that same target. But now's the time to invest, and you're going to see a lot of really interesting things come out of it 3 to 4 years from now.
Second to last question. You've had enormous success in the last year in getting into the studio world. You've really made a hell of a name for yourself. You have a bandwidth problem now, which is a great problem to have. And you just had your first kid.
Yes.
How does it feel?
It is very weird. When I first started out on this, my intent was to very specifically not become the public face of any of this. I'm an introvert by nature. Like, this has been a very, very interesting journey to come to this point. It's been fantastic. Like, I never would have volunteered for it had I, known. But now I would absolutely do it hands down any day of the week. It's been a journey.
And the last question is, what comes next for Matt Burris?
Ooh. Well, I think my immediate focus is portfolio company number 1 that we're building out right now. Continuing to, of course, support some studios in the space. We've got a data project that I'm getting kicked off the ground as well to add a lot more around best practices in the space. But number 1 focus, build that company.
Love it. How can people find you aside from LinkedIn, or is that the main spot?
LinkedIn is the best place. If you do send me a direct message on LinkedIn, I will get back to you. However, if I'm slow, ping me again, because it wouldn't surprise me if it got buried. It happens. You can find everything I do on LinkedIn. So that's the best place to start.